Well, good evening, everyone, and a warm welcome to this event facilitated by Blue Star International and the Australian Centre for Christianity and Culture. I'm Genevieve Jacobs, and I'll be managing the conversation this evening. Now, I want to acknowledge that we meet on the lands of the Ngunnawal people, and I honour their ongoing custodianship of this place. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and commit myself to ongoing acts of reconciliation. This is the second of Blue Star and the Australian Centre for Christianity and Culture's series of conversations around the theme of racism. Tonight, we're going to discuss with our panellists whether the Australian education system, in all its manifestations, is doing all that it can to combat racism, or whether more can be done. Let me introduce you now to our panellists. Elizabeth Lee is the Shadow Minister for Education in the ACT and the first elected member of an Australian Parliament of Korean descent. She's also Assistant Speaker, Shadow Minister for Disability and the Environment and the member for Kurrajong. She was elected in 2016. Prior to her election, Elizabeth was a law lecturer at the Australian National University and the University of Canberra. She's also practiced as a commercial litigation lawyer in both private and government practice. And she is the mum of a 14-month-old daughter who we have just been hearing in the background, who was born whilst Elizabeth has been in office. Michael Plato is a professor of psychology at the ANU. He's published widely on the social psychology of leadership and social influence, on justice, fairness and trust, intergroup relationships, including prejudice and discrimination, and also education. His research has been recognised by his election as a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia, and he currently holds leadership positions as an ANU Distinguished Educator and Associate Director in Science Education. The Reverend Karen Keim is a Birrippa woman whose family come from Dingo Creek on the north coast of New South Wales. Karen was ordained as a priest in 2000, has had several key ministry roles and worked with Aboriginal nations in southeastern Australia for over 30 years. In 2012, she was the Anglican delegate to the UN Commission on the Status of Women, and in 2013, she was ordained Archdeacon of Indigenous Ministries in the Canberra-Goulburn Diocese of the Anglican Church. She has a particular interest in the Wise Practices Framework of Care, a model of social practice developed by and for First Nations people. At present, Karen is the General Manager of Cultural Safety and Training with Anglicare. And a warm welcome to you all. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
Michael, I want to start with you with a definition, if we can, of what is and what is not prejudice. Give us your sense of what that means.
Yeah, that's a fantastic place to start, but it's a remarkably challenging place to start. The psychologists have been studying prejudice for 70 years at least, and what's remarkable is that we struggle ourselves to come up with a definition. I suppose that one of the most prominent features of what we consider to be prejudice is that it's bad, and that it's about groups. And beyond that, we often struggle with our definitions. Sometimes they're seen as negative emotions toward other groups, negative attitudes. But sometimes people actually include positive attitudes. You can say something positive about a particular group, and still that might be construed or understood to be prejudice or serve as a way of maintaining, say, power imbalances and so on. And what's most striking in our own research is that that diversity of views, let's say, is mirrored among everyday people. There's not I think in my view, this is a challenge that we face trying to combat prejudice, because we all have a common agreement about what it is to begin with. Mm-hmm. So from my view, really, it's typically negative attitudes toward members of other groups that are counter to the norms and values that we ourselves hold. That's what makes it bad. These are the things that we think are not good because they're counter to the things that we hold dear, that we value, and those are the things that we label as prejudice.
Just to follow on with that for just a moment, why do people hold prejudiced views? Where does that come from within either the human psyche itself, within our socialisation? What are the
I don't think that anybody, it's a rare person, I've not met one, who says, hello, how do you do? I'm prejudiced. Most of us would think, no, I'm not prejudiced at all. What I'm doing is I'm telling you the truth. And in fact, our research shows that people think that if they're speaking accurately and truthfully, then they're not being prejudiced, whatever, even if they're saying negative things about other groups. They're just saying, well, that's the truth, isn't it? And so I actually think that people typically believe that they are speaking the truth. I don't believe that there are evil people out there. Yes, I'm not naive, I'm not foolish, but I actually believe that our everyday experiences with this, people are somehow have some understanding of reality, of social relations, of things that this is a truth. Where do they get this? Through their parents, through the media, through their friends, through maybe their own experiences. Maybe they had bad experiences with people of certain groups. I mean, humans are terrible at integrating information. Computers are far better than we are integrating information. So, I might have had one bad experience and that colors all of my further experiences or the way I interpret it. So there's a whole range of reasons. I think people, maybe I'm slightly optimistic even for the prejudiced. I think that people are genuinely thinking that they're being honest and truthful. It's just that we're disagreeing over what the reality is, what that truth is. And that's where I think, of course, education has something to play, a role to play.
Elizabeth Lee, it is reasonably often said that Australia is a racist society at some level. I mean, certainly often an ignorant community. I just wondered if you could describe that for me from the perspective perhaps of your own experience. Now, the assumption would be here you are a lawyer and elected representative, someone who does not necessarily face boundaries. Have you faced prejudice in your own life?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because, and as Michael said, I think that we all bring our own perspectives, and that's very coloured by everything from what our parents taught us through to our personal experiences, through to what we read or what we actually try and hone in on and follow as well. For me, I came to Australia when I was very young, so I was 7 years old, and at the time, I think one of the beauties of youth, as a child, is that you do see the world through a different lens, and you haven't been coloured yet by those experiences. And so, some of the experiences that I recall now as quite racist, I didn't see it as racist at the time, and I didn't see it as somebody looking at me in a different way purely because of my Asian background. But of course, now in hindsight, after the years of education and what I know now, I look back and go, actually, that was because I was Asian. This person said that to me because I was Asian or because I couldn't speak English. So it's a very interesting when we talk about it from perspective, if that makes sense. And I know that as much as in Canberra, I think we are very fortunate to have a relatively highly educated population, and certainly people are polite enough not to overtly be racist or say remarks that they believe would be hurtful. There certainly are still, and I still experience this, sometimes comments that are made to me or in my direction or about me that show that sometimes other people are looking at me and see very first and foremost my Asianness, and sometimes that can be quite obvious to someone like me, but perhaps not to that person.
Well, and I just wonder about that, because just following on from the idea that perhaps we can be quite an ignorant society, and we saw this, for example, in the Black Lives Matter protests, where there was very little knowledge of things like blackbirding and indentured labour, having been a very real and well-recognised part of our history, but that's sort of been forgotten in a sense. Do we have a national blind spot over the reality of racism and prejudice? Do you think that we've somehow convinced ourselves, as you say, that people are really not particularly being racist or prejudiced, but just expressing the truth as they see it?
I think that we all, and this is human nature, want to think that we are being our best selves. So it is a very difficult thing to try and hold a mirror up to yourself and say, hold on, I am flawed. So it can be a very difficult situation for any person. And as a nation, I think we face that. And it's not limited or unique just to racism either. You know, it is a difficult thing and a bit of a soul-searching moment. So can we, as a society, do better? Of course. We will always probably feel that. But, you know, we can't forget history because that's what has taught us to be better. So there is a bit of a balance in terms of being realistic about our past, what has happened, and also being realistic enough to know that we all have flaws, but we are also accepting that we are going to, you know, do better in the future.
And Karen Calm, I just sort of think, following through that thought and how it interacts with the education system, in fact, school has been a breeding ground for prejudice and racism. Let's be honest about that many, many times in the past. And I grew up in Western New South Wales at a tiny little village school. And in preparing for this interview myself, I remembered a really confusing time in primary school where a couple of girls came to school and were treated very badly. And I did not understand what was happening. I could not understand what was happening. And what it was, of course, in this tiny Western New South Wales country school, was that their mother was Aboriginal and that their father was a white itinerant worker.
Yeah.
And I've never forgotten the feeling of being completely flummoxed by what was going on. But clearly what was happening was that many of the kids I was at school with had been told there was something wrong with these children. And that was
right.
a shared assumption there in the 1970s schoolyard. So it can be at an incredibly early stage, can't it?
Absolutely, Genevieve. And I can remember myself being in the schoolyard and having overt and really covert, like passive forms of racism, simply being excluded from things, you know. And my parents had experienced the same, and I had experienced the same. I did not expect that my children, who are now grown, that I would have to speak to them about racism. And now I really, you know, just recently I had to speak about racism to my grandchildren and to equip them, you know, to help them be resilient and to act on it, you know, within the school. So it's so prevalent. And I would have to disagree that most prejudice is sort of like, you know, not undertaken consciously, because I think of Adam Goodes and I think of the way his football club responded and other Australians responded around that sport. And that was certainly really overt forms of racism. So, and I know there have been other experiences, you know, even today. So it is really prevalent, and I really didn't expect that it would be so prevalent today.
I think that's an incredibly sad reflection that you still need to talk to your grandchildren about this.
That's right.
So let's pivot towards this theme of education and the role of schools in education. Do you think, Karen, that our education system does reflect fully on the history of the nation? I mean, what do you think?
No. When I went to school, it was all about the achievers and the heroes and the explorers of white people, you know, and there was no education in relation to Aboriginal Australians. And I know when my children were going to school, it was the same. I think perhaps there has been some attempts now, and some schools do it wonderfully. They're even teaching language, which is really exciting. But most of the education within schools is largely about white history and white successes. And I think we need to really address that white privilege within our institutions, including the education system. I don't think it addresses the impact of colonisation on our people and what that history involved and who our resistant fighters were, you know, and who our heroes were and the impact on our families and communities. And I also don't think it educates very well or celebrates Aboriginal heritage and culture, because it's so rich and it should be celebrated and it should be taught. But I don't think it is very well.
So I think we've got two things here. We've got talking to children about race, but then also talking to children about racism. And those two things necessarily stand side by side to some degree, although they're slightly different. Elizabeth, if I can come back to you, do you think that the current ACT or Australian education system is clear about racism? I mean, is there a need for reform not only on the history of race, but also racism itself?
I mean, it's a difficult question to answer, Genevieve, because there's going to be many different views about what people think is appropriate, sufficient, or, whether it's a complete picture or not. There's clearly not enough Aboriginal history that is taught in our schools. I think that I think we can all acknowledge that, and that is something that needs to be actively worked on. But we also know that with concepts like race and racism and prejudice and stereotypes, that our schools can't be all. So education does come from very, very broad range of factors, including from family, and it is incumbent on parents and grandparents and other trusted adults around children to be able to provide a bit of a safe ground for asking some of the difficult questions and discussing some of those very challenging topics, but also to be able to be role models and set good examples as well, because I think children do pick up from a lot of different areas, not just formal education.
Michael, do you think that this is the responsibility of the education system? Is there a way for education to mitigate against racism in a very direct and intentional fashion?
Yeah, I do. I'm a big fan of public education, and I think that's public schools and public education is what effectively allows a democracy, if you will, to replicate itself in the next generation. And we are just the custodians, if you will, of that nation at the moment, and we're handing it over to those children, and we need to make sure that they will carry the traditions on and the values on that we want them to carry on. And some of those traditions and some of those values are values and traditions explicitly expressing our anti-racist, anti-prejudice views. But some of those traditions that we might want are traditions of challenging, because at some point we want our children to challenge us back and say, hey, this happens all the time, right? The younger generation always sees us old guys as so behind the times, and they should be challenging us. We should be prepared to be challenged and have our views potentially reflected back to us and say, oh yeah, gee, I never realized all these years I was saying something and I thought I was being okay, and actually now my children have brought it to my attention that that's really not on anymore. And if we can bring both of those kinds of things to our education system, both understanding the values of tolerance and multiculturalism and acceptance, but also pushing the boundaries all the time to reflect back on us, I think that will be certainly a step in the right direction.
But is ensuring that students are exposed to diverse perspectives helpful? I mean, we've already got some questions coming in actually, and one of which is what are some concrete steps we can take in the education field to educate our children? But Michael, to you just on that, do we know whether it works to simply expose children to diverse perspectives?
Well, yes and no. I mean, let me just step aside for a second and say, look, we teach lots of things in school, and we know that not everything sticks. So we know that we teach, mathematics, and the kids don't care and forget about it. We know we teach about science, and we teach about evolution, and maybe the kids go home and their parents might say, well, actually, we believe in Genesis, and so we actually don't believe that that's accurate. So the kids will take things home and they'll hear other things. So we know that on a whole range of things. So we shouldn't be expecting that we'll just teach something about prejudice in the schools and it'll stick. But we need to do it. We don't just teach science to first graders. We start with something in first grade and we take it all the way through year 12, because we know that that's what we need to do. And we as a society have agreed that we value science, we value the humanities, we value these other things. And we should, as a society, say we value tolerance, anti-prejudice, acceptance, diversity, and start that in year 1 and follow it as we do all the way through year 12, like anything else that we teach, because that's our values.
Karen, I have a question from someone who is wondering how you explained racism to your grandchildren. What did you talk to them about?
I spoke to them about, that so difficult. I tried to discuss with him the importance of, I guess, standing up for himself and valuing who he is, and not accepting other people's opinions, and I guess talking about being strong in himself, but also how to take actions within the school to remedy that. And to some extent that has worked.
I mean, I guess I'm a little curious about that, because if you are talking to your grandchildren about how to take action within the school, in one sense that's empowering, but in another sense, gee, it's a shame that has to happen, isn't it?
It is, absolutely. And it causes anxiety. Children who experience racism become really anxious, and they can become depressed because of it, and they don't want to go to school. So I think schools need to really focus on being safe places for our children. And I agree with Michael, it's not just enough to teach something within the curriculum. I actually think that if you're going to be teaching about a culture, and especially in Australian Indigenous culture, then you need community input within that school.
Elizabeth, given that you're raising a daughter, is this something that you've considered? She's very young, I know, you're a beautiful little girl, but is this something that you've thought about talking to her about?
Oh, look, there's no doubt that, so my daughter is, I suppose, mixed race, for want of a better description. Her father is Anglo-Australian. And one of the things that I have thought about is about what her experiences will be like as somebody who is of mixed race. And I have to say that the concerns that I have was the people who might go up to her and ask her, maybe you're well-meaning, but where are you from? What's your background? Because I can't quite tell. But in a way, I don't know what's better, because with someone like me that is overtly Asian, people actually automatically make stereotypes. Either you're a bad driver, you're good at maths, your parents did this, whatever it might be, the typical sort of stuff that comes up. But with her, I think it'll be sort of like, oh, I don't know what prejudice to put you at yet, because I'm not sure what you are. So it is something that does cross my mind. I've also thought about if we are traveling abroad, especially if I take her back to my home country of Korea, and because it is such a homogenous country in Korea, they are now a little bit, at least in Seoul, probably exposed to a few more non-Koreans. But if you go to some of the villages where my family grew up, it will probably still be a pretty unique sight to see somebody who's not of Korean heritage. And I do think about how will I describe that to my daughter, or how will I make sure that she doesn't feel alienated or left out. So it is something that does cross my mind. And I think, just I want to add a point to what Michael and Karen both talked about in terms of in the education space. It is right, because when you formally teach something, it's not going to be enough for somebody or a student or a child to pick up on that and go with it. It is about living it and breathing it as well. And we see in our schools that there's already concern, for example, that there is a lack of male primary school teachers, and people do wonder about, is that going to be a little bit of a challenge for some of the young boys who may want or need a strong male role model, and that's missing in our primary schools. But also things like, having, I remember when I was in school, I don't think I ever came across a single Asian teacher who wasn't a maths teacher or a science teacher. So there's that stereotype already that the Asians are good at maths and science. And I never came across an Asian teacher who did drama or who did English or music. And that's pretty sad as well. So it is about making sure that we get a huge range of diverse range of talents that we can into our teaching profession, so that our children are exposed to it on a day-to-day basis.
Now, I do want in a moment to move this towards some of the faith-based perspectives that we can bring to this, given that this is a forum for the Australian Centre for Christianity and Culture and the Dialogue for Intercultural Dialogue Institute. But another interesting question, and I think, Karen, this perhaps goes to you. This listener says, I don't think I was taught about positionality, specifically about Indigenous perspectives, explicitly until university. Is there something we can do to improve our lower education curriculum?
I think simply about teaching the history of our nation and about teaching about race and about the racial superiority that seems to dominate here in Australia. And I think it's really important that children in high school learn about that and become aware of that and can identify race and discrimination. I just think that's really important. And it's an empowering thing for them as well.
I do actually want to bring the faith dimension in here. Elizabeth, I mean, we see continued Islamophobia, we see anti-Semitism. In addition to racial discrimination, religious discrimination is very much a real thing. This is also increasingly a secular nation. Now, that means that many students won't necessarily experience religious or cultural traditions. We've been talking very broadly about education as if it were one sort of homogenous thing in Australia, when of course it's not necessarily. Do you think that faith has a role to play in a way that helps students overcome prejudice and hatred?
I think faith has a very important role to play in our society overall, and we need to ensure that parents and the broader public have choice when it comes to educating their children, and some parents, of course, choose a faith-based education for their children. But one of the things that I was really actually pleasantly surprised, and I shouldn't have been surprised, but I was when I did go visit in my capacity as Shadow Minister for Education, visit a faith-based school, and they actually, I just assumed that they would be teaching their faith and their religion, but they actually had in their classroom a board which set up, they'd been working on a project of like all different types of religions. And when I asked about it, and I said, I was a bit surprised that this is happening. Obviously, they teach their education is based on their religion of the school that they are, but they were unapologetic about making sure that their children were exposed to the notion that there are different religions, that there are different faiths, and that other people all around the world believe in different things, and it's all to be celebrated, their differences, and we can all live harmoniously. And I think that was a really good thing.
Michael Plato, if I just turn back to you on that, is there room in public education, if it's not from a specifically sort of faith-based perspective, but perhaps for sort of other ethics and values-based education around race? I mean, you referred at the beginning of this conversation to the things that we think that are good and right. So those shared values don't necessarily need to come from a religious perspective, but is there room in the public sector for that?
Oh, absolutely. I think that's right. I think there is. I mean, because we teach it anyway. If we just go back to science, we have no problem teaching our children that the way to find out about the world is through science, through chemistry, biology, physics. Those are all required. We have no problems telling them that this is the way to do it. So that's a value. That's okay. So we can tell them, we can teach other values as well. We just need to come to a consensus about what our Australian values are and what's the Australian society we hope to build. But if I can just, pause as a step aside for a sec. I mean, we also need to recognize that in a way, this remains a very Christian society. Christmas is a public holiday. Easter is a public holiday. The official head of state is the head of the Anglican Church. Okay, and so people very kindly, very innocently, very warm, say to me every December, Merry Christmas. I'm Jewish. I don't celebrate Christmas. Are they evil? No. Are they prejudiced? They're not really. But they, of all the people in this panel, I'm the white male who has all the privileges. But the matter of fact is that, people kind of forget that Christmas is not an Australian holiday. It's a Christian holiday, and not all Australians celebrate it. And so these are things that can be taught in public schools as well, even though Christmas remains a public holiday, we all get it off and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, I think we can.
Karen, I guess we add a different layer of complexity if we turn towards colonial history. Now, we talked about the staggering lack of knowledge about historical facts like blackbirding, say, and you know, we're only now beginning to have really much more in-depth understanding of massacre histories, for example. But how do you suggest that we best approach not only an accurate version of our own Australian First Nations history, but also a compassionate and an informed view of that history? How do we let people into that history at an early age in our school system?
I think through, not just through the curriculum, but ensuring that we have Aboriginal voices, making sure that it's a lived experience in learning, and providing really positive role models, and ensuring that we teach about the strengths of our culture and our heritage and its value. Michael was just talking about values, and I was thinking about the incredible values our people have of being community, of the common good, of, you know, their way of being family, and also things like, you know, being able to survive on this beautiful landscape that we all live on, and knowing how to care for country, you know, and knowing how to live with the environment instead of on the environment. And I think that there's so much that our people can offer, can bring to, I guess, the spirituality of other faiths. You know, how our own spirituality and connection to country can enrich, I guess, our knowledge and relationship with the Creator.
I've got a question on that from the audience. I know it's been said that simply teaching Indigenous studies is not enough, but should there be more taught about Australia's diversity during late primary school and during the formative years, 7 to 10, as a standalone subject each year up to year 10, which allows for more community organisations to be involved in teaching all these traditions? I might ask several of you what you think about that. Elizabeth, how does that strike you, that we actually make a sort of a very strongly distinctive, proactive effort to teach about diversity and use that as a tool of combating racism?
I think I mean, you know, I mentioned this earlier, and teaching, like, you know, in that sense of teacher at the front and here's the curriculum and here's what it is, here's your set readings and all of that is one thing. And I don't obviously downplay the importance of that, but something as complex and also as I suppose with such a diverse views of what is appropriate to it, does need to have more than just a pen to paper sort of approach. And, you know, we talked about living it, but it's also about having the role models that are visible as well. One of the things that I have spoken about is the fact that before I entered politics, I just didn't see many Asian faces in Australian politics. And I think you would probably say that you still don't. And it's very difficult for someone, a young person, to either aspire to be in that role if they don't know that that actually is an option for them. And so I think it is about ensuring that we do expose our young people as much as possible to it in an organic way, as well as that teaching of it.
Michael, I do have another question which kind of follows on from this, which says, to be a citizen of the world and to harness a universal view on a lot of things, how important is it to teach religion and ethics in years 7 to 10? So we've been talking about modelling diversity, but do you think that there's a strong argument for making religion and or ethics something that is fundamentally a part of the curriculum rather than an add-on extra as it often is now?
Well, you know, you're asking me partially my values as well. I'm not sure that we need to teach religion per se, but I do think that teaching values is right and good, because I do believe we are already implicitly, if not explicitly, teaching one set of values or another in the content and the curriculum that we already have. They're just potentially not explicitly, you know, we're not explicit about them. We're just telling these kids, this is reality. Okay, but we're structuring and constructing reality, whether it's our history, whether it's the diversity of the nation one way or another, in a particular way, and the kids are going, oh yeah, okay, well, the teacher says that's right. Okay, So the values are already there. I think what we need to do is be explicit about what we want to achieve as a nation in terms of these values and integrate it fully into the curriculum.
I've got, as a tertiary educator, Michael, another really quite interesting question that's come in, which says that the federal government has valued STEM subjects over the humanities and arts with their funding structure. How does that affect our identity formation when the government wants more technically savvy people who perhaps think in a binary way rather than tolerating and engaging in a conversation of difference with respect? Well, I would absolutely rush to say that I don't think we ought to imply that everyone who is technically savvy necessarily thinks in a binary fashion. But it's an interesting one to conjure with when we're talking about profound questions about the identity of our community, that the priorities that are emerging often do seem to be directed towards creating people who are technically highly geared as a priority. And Michael, you must see that at university.
I don't want to get into political discussions, but let's just say that I would value prioritizing the humanities at an equal level with the sciences. I think because the humanities are our history, are our culture, are our values, and you will be a better scientist if you have grounding in the humanities. I also believe you'll be a better ethicist if you have an understanding of science. I actually believe that. So I think I think prioritizing one over the other is foolish. But the story that I could recount is just a mate of mine who is in the United States he wanted to be a physician. He is now a physician, and he in the U.S. you do university before you go to medical school, and he studied ethnomusicology as his undergraduate major. And I remember as a teenager, 18-year-old, you got to be crazy, man. No one's going to accept you. You got to do chemistry, biology, physics. He did all of that, but he did ethnomusicology, and he got into medical school because they wanted a human being. He had all the technical skills, but he can now speak to people from different cultures. He could work with them. He understood them. And that's what we need.
Yeah, and I think that makes the extremely fair point. Someone who studied Latin for 6 years of high school, and people have often said, "What use did you get out of that?" And I said, "Vast, immense use, which continues to this day, decades and decades later, because of course it's about training your brain, it's about forming a worldview, it's about all kinds of things that are not immediately obvious on the surface. If we simply say, well, this is STEM, that's humanities, and never the twain shall meet." Karen, I just want to go to you on this question of how we act sort of ethically and compassionately with regard to questions around racism, which can be so deeply painful and so problematic. I was interested in the wise practices framework that you've done some work with, and perhaps if that is an approach to complex and painful problems like the ones we've been discussing from a First Nations perspective. Could you talk to us about that?
Yeah, Wise Practices Framework has been developed by and for First Nations people, and it has its roots in community development, and it's a way of working with families and communities, and it's about it's based on First Nations ways of being and doing, so it's based on Aboriginal ways of being family. It's not on Western ways of being a nuclear family, and it's based on Aboriginal values and culture. So it's right at the centre of the way that you work with people, and it's a way of affirming the culture and identity of people, and it's a really powerful way of working. So in where I work, we have a lot of children in out-of-home care, a lot of Aboriginal children, and we work with families. So we're not using Western frameworks of being good parents. We're using the strengths of Aboriginal parenting. We're using the strengths of Aboriginal ways of being family and community. So that's what we call Wise Practices. And it's a way of empowering our families. So it's about self-determination and recognising the impact of colonisation on our families and on our kids. So it's a very holistic way of working, because well-being for us is not just about the physical and the emotional, it's also very deeply about the spiritual. So we train in the use of wise practices, and it's a really successful way of working. Yeah.
I've got a question which is actually a really sad one. My son in grade 4 has a fair complexion, green eyes and brown hair, and was called black in school because he is a Muslim. I explained to him about the whole mess of race. Should I have taken this to the school? Now, it just occurs to me that the kind of practice that you are describing there is actually about challenging inherent stereotypes and inherent default systems of thinking. But do you accept that those systems of thinking hold strong and are very hard to challenge, and do you try to work against them? And Karen, how would you have responded in that situation?
Absolutely. They're very strong. Yeah, I thoroughly agree.
Yeah, Karen, we're just losing you a little
really
bit.
strong. He wanted to act on this with me, you know. My grandson is 11. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah, we've got you now.
Yeah, so it was about walking on that little experience with him and leaving some of that decision making up to him, you know, and seeing as to whether he wanted me to act on it. If it was a very young child, I would be speaking to the school, because the schools need to make them safe places for children of all cultures. Yeah, but I left it up to my grandson in that situation.
Okay. Michael Plato, your analysis of prejudice focuses on shared values. How do we pursue and achieve shared values in a secular education system?
Well, I think we just need to come. It's part of the curriculum design. We need to, just as I kind of said already, you know, just as we agree that we're going to teach science in a particular way, or a certain amount of science, we're going to teach math in a certain kind of way, history in a certain kind of way. We need to agree on values that we teach, and we introduce it into the curriculum in a whole range of ways, and that's who, because that's who we are, because that is the Australia that we want, because that is the Australia we aspire to, because these, as I said, we are just here for a while, and the next generation who will take hold of this this nation, this democracy, is going to be in their hands. How are they going to bring us forward and continue it? And, you know, we teach values about democracy. We do. I mean, that's part of it. That's a value. Why don't we teach, you know, values of autocracy? Because we think that's wrong. Okay, so none of this is unusual. Okay, so there's a place for it. One of the things that we do need to do, though, is make sure our teachers know how to teach it. Okay, I do wonder whether they, when they go to when they go to university to learn to be a teacher, whether they are taught how to teach these things. And if not, I think that needs to be added to their curriculum.
Elizabeth, what do you think about establishing those shared values and where they come from, regardless perhaps of faith, perhaps acknowledging faith, but not necessarily relying on faith? I mean, how do you think we pursue and achieve shared values in a secular education system?
I think that, you know, as Michael said, it is, we do it now. Like, it's not that we don't do it. So it would be kidding ourselves if we didn't say that the Australian education system has been shaped by the values of Australians from, you know, past generations. That has happened, is happening, and no doubt will happen. So it is up to us as a society to determine where we want our values to develop into the future, and what we want our children to know, to value, and to start living. And that's why, you know, I 100% agree with Michael in the sense that we are the custodians, and we need to be not just thinking about what we think or value now, but what it is that we want our future generations to as well. I think that faith does have a role in terms of, because it's not something that you can ignore, because we've got, you know, years and years and years and generations of history, and it would be a real shame if all the knowledge that had been built up, and this is across the world as well. I mean, religion isn't unique to our country, or various religions. And so it would be a real shame if we decided to just throw that out because we are becoming a secular society. I think that there is an enormous amount that we can learn from it. I, as a firm believer in education, I believe that more knowledge is power, and that is what's going to shape us and our future generation.
Karen Keim, how do you respond as an ordained Anglican minister to the idea of public education in combating prejudice without necessarily a faith-based framework? What's your response?
Oh, Genevieve. Look, I am really passionate about teaching religion in schools. I really am. And I think it can contribute to that. But at the same time, I don't necessarily think that that's enough. So I am in favour, in these humanities subjects within schools. I think it's critical that we do teach some of this. I think it can't just be one or the other. I think it needs to be both. And I would dearly love one day to get rid of the terms accepting or tolerating and use the word celebrating. I think that's so important. I get tired of listening to conversations or reading literature that just talks about this tolerating or accepting. We need to get way past that. In Anglicare, we have a particular office that most people love visiting because it's a great place to work, because the teams there are highly culturally diverse, and they're a really dynamic team. And I think that we need to acknowledge what cultural diversity brings to the workplace, but also within our education system, and what it can do for our younger generations.
We're not too far from the end of our discussion as it happens. So I just want to say to anyone who's listening at home, if you've got questions, you've got just not that long to get them in. So please send them through. A really fascinating one that's just come through. What are your thoughts on establishing a national anti-racism strategy? And this questioner says, racism is present in our workplaces, our schools, and our communities. We cannot change what we don't name. Elizabeth, does that strike you? You're from a liberal perspective, the idea of sort of dictating strategy, forming strategy, is that valuable, or is that something that we ought to be able to manage in other ways?
Look, there is obviously value in, as the questioner said, naming what it is that we want to combat or overcome. But at the same time, I would hate to see that all this energy and effort and resources go into forming this strategy without the actual follow through and the implementation, because I think that's when it actually comes to a head. So we can all have, summits and conferences and put together strategies and have beautifully glossy documents about, what the problem is and how we want to achieve it and all these goals. But if it doesn't actually translate into actions and implementation and cultural change, which we all know is so difficult to happen, to overcome very quickly, then that will all come to naught. So we need to ensure that if we are embarking on that path, that we are serious about taking it to the full extent, as opposed to just here's a glossy document at the end of it.
Mm-hmm. Michael Plato, how do you react to the idea of an anti-racism strategy?
I think that would be fantastic. I think it's the right thing to do, because at the moment, certainly I've been talking a lot about things like values. That's very important to me in this analysis. But there are also just kind of structural things as well that the way institutions are set up and that need to be changed as well. So identifying the thing that we need to combat and setting up a strategy will not only tell us what the curriculum in a school should be, but maybe how to set up the structure of the school and the rest of our institutions. So, there are prejudiced people, but there are prejudiced institutions that kind of perpetuate it. I think sexism is a kind of the classic example. Men have a lot of interaction with women. It's not just, meeting someone from another group is going to make the prejudice go away. men have a lot of experience interacting with women, and men are still very sexist, partially because of the way we're taught, and partially because of the institutional structures that allow us, men, to rise to the top in ways that women are not really allowed. So I think, yeah, fantastic.
Karen, what are your thoughts about something that's as clearly laid out as a national structure, a strategy, on the basis that I think it's true, if you can't see it, you can't be it. If you can't name it, you can't change it.
Absolutely. And I think some of our institutions need those guideposts for behaviour. And I think the Black Lives Matter stuff sort of clearly indicates that. Having worked in tertiary education, I've been amazed at how many graduates leave education or social work or policing having no education at all about how to work with Aboriginal people. And I think you see that in the incarceration rates of Aboriginal people, which is just enormous, and the number of Aboriginal children that are not returned home, who are in out-of-home care at the moment. Just how many graduates we have working in our institutions who have no idea and are not prepared to work with our people, and who don't understand the impact of all of that unconscious bias stuff. So I think we need those guideposts, as well as improving education at the other end as well.
And a question about education. This listener says, while attempting to teach different cultures, religions and perspectives within our schools, do we risk being tokenistic? And if so, how can we mitigate this? And I might just start with you again, Karen, on that one, because that can be a bit of a risk, can't it? We can name all sorts of wonderfully diverse religious beliefs, ethnic backgrounds, all kinds of diversity, and we kind of skate over the top of it and, you know, give the sort of the brief notes version of it, the spark notes version of it. And that can also not particularly have any value in combating the kind of racism and prejudice we're talking about.
And you know, Elizabeth said something about the importance of role models. It really needs to be a lived experience for children. I mean, I do a lot of training in preparing people to work with our people, but again, it needs to be a lived experience, and it needs the voices of other Aboriginal people to do that as well. So I think it's tokenistic when you don't go to that extent, and it's just something that they read in a book or listen to, you know, an educator say. They need to be able to feel. They need to be able to connect with those people of other cultures.
Elizabeth, how do you respond to the idea that there is actually a bit of a risk here of diminishing the very richness and diversity that we're trying to enhance? If we do this badly in our schools, it just looks like, well, reminds me of, you know, 4th grade social studies back at Quandialla in 1975, when it was all about, here are the Eskimos. And that's not particularly productive in combating the kind of racism and prejudice we've been discussing.
No, and it's not long lasting, and that's why, you know, when we did discuss education a bit earlier in the session tonight, was saying that it does go deeper than skin deep in terms of that, you know, pen to paper approach. Yes, there is value in obviously what the teacher is saying and you know, in the classroom context, but we really do need to ensure that there is cultural change and that there is deep rooted change in terms of how students and young people feel it, because they need to feel it, not just sort of hear it and not just see it. They need to be actually able to feel it so that it does have an ingrained position in their psyche, and that it actually does change their perspective and it does change the way they look at the world.
And Michael Platter, to you on that. I mean, we can do real damage by being well-meaning people from dominant cultures who sail in a very ill-informed fashion.
Yes, there's no question about that. And this is why this needs to be a broad and equal status conversation, first to identify what those values are, what our goals are, and then a broad and inclusive equal status discussion of how that's going to be implemented. But at the same time, I you know, I don't mean to sound pessimistic, I suppose, but I fully expect that the next generation, this group of kids, we could be very successful with these children. Let's say we got it perfectly to the way we want it, and we taught them this, and it was somehow we all agreed that this was right. I do believe that when they're our age, they're going to come back and challenge us back. I said this kind of earlier. I do believe that this is the nature of human relations. We come to different understandings in different historical periods, and it's going to hurt us for our children to call us prejudiced. That's social change, though. That's the way it is, and they will be better than us. We need to simply give them the groundwork and the framework and the tools to almost allow them to identify our prejudices as well.
So I guess if I could summarize what we've discussed tonight, there's a very much an acknowledgement that racism is something that's real, that perhaps we can be a little blind to in this country in its many forms. But there's a place certainly in the education system at all levels for addressing both race and the history of race and race relations in this country, but also additionally in identifying the reality of racism. And that is something that we agree as a culture and as a community is not a fair or a right thing. That there's a number of ethical perspectives that we can bring to bear on that, and that many of them are indeed faith-based, but also that it's possible, I think, to bring those values together absent of a particular engagement with faith, but being informed by faith as something that has meaning and significance to our community as a whole. And that the diversity of faith experiences is something that can inform us very, very strongly with regard to racism and prejudice. I really liked, Karen, the wise practices framework. I thought that was something that I could absolutely see being implemented as a way to combat the kinds of prejudices and difficulties we've talked about, but that we look towards the future, that it's incredibly important for us to invest and to look towards the future in a way that's wholehearted and thoughtful and that goes towards creating a better Australia for all of us. And look, it's been an absolutely fascinating conversation. Thank you all very, very much indeed for participating and for sharing your own experiences too. I think, Karen, very powerful to hear you talk about having to discuss racism with your grandchild, and Elizabeth, for you to be thinking, you know, about how to talk to your child about where she will fit, and that these things are still questions that we need to ask. So I want to thank you all very much indeed for participating, and I want to also thank all the people who've sent in actually lots and lots of really interesting questions. You know, I wondered how this system would work, but in fact, the questions have just been rolling through in an almost sort of ceaseless flood. So, so thank you very much to Michael Platow, to Karen Kime, and to Elizabeth Lee. It's been a great pleasure. And to the audience members, thank you for your questions. Please also register for the upcoming conversation that's being co-hosted by the Australian Centre for Christianity and Culture and Blue Star International. And the next one is a conversation on racism and the law. So those panellists will be Shane Rattenbury, who is the Greens leader in the Legislative Assembly, Des Manderson from the ANU, and Julie Tongs, OAM, from the Woononga Nimiti Jar Aboriginal Health Centre. So you can find more details from Eventbrite or Blue Star Intercultural's Facebook and Twitter. Thank you all so much, and good night to you all.
Good night. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.